time to look, you'll find them everywhere. So keep your eyes open,
and soon you'll understand
that the lines that can help you most are lines on the land.
Okay, I'd like you to pick up your tubes and use them to look around the room for examples of lines. Raise your hand if you see any. Greg.
The lines on a cupboard.
Megan.
The lines on the table.
Cammie.
The lines in the light.
Steve.
The lines on the wall.
The lines on the skeleton.
Chris.
The line in the middle of the board.
That's right, there are lines all around us, but some of the lines that are least understood by people are the lines in the countryside, and they're the ones that make a big difference to us.
Keep your eyes open,
and soon you'll understand
that the lines that can help you most are lines on the land.
When you've been on a trip through the country, did you ever notice the lines and patterns on the land? How did they get there? Which ones are helpful to us? When do you think they first started to get there?
How about you? If you'll watch close and listen for the next few minutes, you'll find out what those lines are and how they affect you. You might already know how some of the lines are made.
Soil erosion makes some of the lines you may see on the land. As water splashes on bare soil to dislodge it and then tears away at more soil, lines begin to form.
It could be smaller lines that run through a farm field, like fingers, called rill erosion. Or it could be much larger gullies that have formed as water runs off the land, rain after rain. We'll get back to that in a minute. But first, let's see what some of the other lines are.
There are fence lines that separate fields, and there are simply the lines made by different crops. There are also paths that a farmer or farm livestock make, such as cow paths through a pasture. But you'll find many of the patterns and lines are made by the kind of crop a farmer plants and the way it is planted. How are you on identifying some of Iowa's major crops? Well, here's corn. And our other most plentiful row crop, soybeans. Iowa farmers also grow oats, and they also grow this crop, hay, to feed the livestock. Different types of grasses are direct feed for cattle, horses, sheep, and other livestock that graze in pastures. These primary crops and others give definite lines to the landscape, and that brings us back to the topic of soil erosion. It's the way these crops are grown that can either encourage or discourage the marks of soil erosion.
What this is telling us is that when there's no cover on the soil, rain makes erosion marks when there is a slope. And if we can make the slope shorter or not so steep, then we won't lose as much soil.
Farmers apply those principles to save their topsoil as they farm. And they make lines and patterns on the land that might remind you of some things you're very familiar with. There's the grass waterway, for instance. It safely carries channeled water from a field in natural drainage ways. Without a grass cover, the force of runoff water would tear the soil and leave the gully lines on the land. So, when you see a grass waterway on the land, remember, it works like a water slide to carry the water safely to the bottom of a field.
Now that quarter didn't get to the bottom of the container very fast, did it? You want the same thing to happen with the water in a field. Slow the water down as much as you can to allow it to soak in rather than run off. To do this, farmers plant their crops around the hill rather than up and down the hill. Each crop row serves as a dam to slow the water down. These straight lines up and down the hill will make more erosion lines. A conservation farmer will do his or her best to plant the crops and farm around and around the hill, so water can find the slow path to the bottom of the hill.
Ever make a pizza? I like the part where you cover it with cheese. Some people like a lot of cheese, some just a little. There's a soil conservation measure that reminds me of pizza. It's called conservation tillage, and it's done by leaving the past year's crop residues on top of the ground to give soil cover. After the grain crop is harvested, a farmer has a choice of whether to plow the land which leaves no cover up and allows rain to start soil erosion in action, or to leave the cornstalk or bean plant residue on top of the soil for cover. This crop residue intercepts the rain. The more residue, the better their erosion control. Soil conservationists want you to think in terms of a double cheese pizza.
Of course, live plants can protect the soil the same way. And that's one of the reasons conservation farmers grow hay on hilly land, at least for some of the years. They grow hay for a few years and then row crops like corn and soybeans for a year or two. It's like a quilt if you were to change the colors every year. They call it crop rotation, meaning they rotate or change crops each year. Each year the ground is covered by plants, the soil is well protected.
Whenever you combine soil-saving methods, you get the best soil conservation an American farmer can use. What you see here is contour strip cropping. The farmers get the soil-saving benefits of growing crops on the contour around the hill, as well as having some of the slope or field in hayland to protect the soil. Years ago, some patriotic conservation-minded farmers even made their fields in the shape of a flag to show they cared for their soil and their country.
Do you remember how contouring slowed the water down as it runs off a field? Well, there's an even surer way to slow the water down. It's called terracing. Several mounds of earth are built around the hill. These terraces work like rain spouts on your house. They catch the water and deliver it safely to the bottom of the hill. Terraces work like stair steps, or you might think of them as a terraced yard that reminds you of stair steps. They're fairly costly to build, which is why you may not always see this kind of line on the land.
Another fairly costly practice is a dam or a pond. Conservation farmers build dams across a gully to stop gully erosion, to have a water supply for their livestock, and for better food and water for wildlife on the farm. What a dam makes me think of is when I used to see how much gravy I could get on my potatoes.
Some of the other conservation lines or patterns you may see on the land are from contour buffer strips that work much like strip cropping, and grass filter strips that help improve water quality. This grass filters out soil and other pollutants much like a filter keeps the coffee grounds out of coffee, or lint from plugging a clothes dryer.
Conservation farmers also plant grass field borders that remind you of a picture frame of grass around a field. Many farmers plant grasses, shrubs, and trees to make a better home for wildlife. And some are restoring natural wetlands that are also very beneficial to ducks, geese, and many other species of wildlife. A wetland helps reduce flooding and acts like nature's sponge. It will hold water rather than having it run off downstream.
Before this tape ends, I'd like for you to think about the force of the wind.
And so, what we need to do is slow the wind somehow, like block the wind. If I place someone in front of the fan, you notice that her hair is not blowing. And that's one of the ways farmers protect their fields from the wind, too.
You might see lines of trees out in the fields, or more likely you'll see several lines of trees on some of the sides of farm buildings. These lines of trees block the wind and protect the farmstead and farm animals. The trees may blow in the wind, but the area behind them is protected, the same as the person who's had the wind blocked.
Maybe you can surprise your parents on your next trip to the country.
Show them what those lines are and tell them which lines are made by conservation farmers.
Those lines make a difference for them
and you.